What I did want to do, though, is I wanted to start with just a quick overview. This is what Paul's first journey looked like. So that's Paul's first journey. That's Paul's first mission trip. That's the first getting out and doing something. And I don't know if you noticed it or not, but at this point, we start to see things start to veer away from Jerusalem. Jesus said, you're going to take my message to Jerusalem, Judea, and out to the ends of the earth. So now, at this point in time, we're finally to where Jesus told us to be in the first place, the ends of the earth. It doesn't have anything to do with Israel right now yet. It starts in Antioch, it goes through Greece, and it ends in Antioch. And this is actually at almost 1,600 miles. This is actually the shortest of the trips. But it's the first one to go out to the ends of the earth. And it's the first one, it's the transition point of going from starting with the Jews and then going to the Gentiles, which is what Paul's mission was in the first place. When Jesus talked to, it wasn't Barnabas, Ananias, thank you. When Jesus talked to Ananias in the first place about Paul coming to him and getting the scales removed from his eyes, Jesus told him at that time, I'm going to use him to go into the Gentiles. The whole reason Jesus encountered Saul, Paul, whatever you want to call him in the first place, was to go to the ends of the earth. So we're finally doing that, which means everything's great and good and wonderful. Let's take a quick look. This is what, super quick look. These are all the hits. These are all the places that he went to. Salamis, Paphos, Perga, Antioch, a different Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And then he comes back through all the rest of those. And it's good, and it's great, and it's wonderful, and it's beautiful, and there's peace, and there's people coming, and the message is finally being put out there, and they're finally out on their mission, and they're finally doing this, building the kingdom of God right here on earth. And it's good, right? Right. Everything is just exactly how it should be. The angels are singing in heaven. The light is shining down. It's good, and it's great, and it's beautiful, and nothing can possibly go wrong. Well, that's not true at all. That's not true at all, especially on this very first journey. And we'll break it down a little bit as we go on. But what happens along the way is that every single one of these stops, as we start to break it down, we're going to see a whole new mission starting today. A whole new part of this mission starting today. Because it's all not always good and great and wonderful. And today we're going to start to understand how to approach it when it's not that. So we're starting with...
You seek the oracle. Who are you? I am Seraph. I can take you to her. But first I must apologize. Apologize for what? For this. as many enemies, I had to be sure. Of what? That you are the one. Could have just asked. No, you do not truly know someone until you fight them.
Yeah, that's the look. Wait, what? You don't truly know someone until you fight them? Are you kidding me? See, that's what this first mission journey was more like. It wasn't like angels shining down from heaven. It wasn't that the gates opened up and it was wonderful and beautiful and easy. It was a fight. It was a fight to the death at times. Literally. It was a fight all along the way. And when they got back, there was more fighting. There was fighting with people who were Jews. They were fighting with people who were Gentiles. They were fighting in and amongst themselves. And through it all, they learned who one another was. They learned more about each other. So as ridiculous as it sounds, sure, there's an element of truth in that. You don't truly know one another until you fought with them. I struggled with this all my life. I struggled with this with my dad, who constantly tried to get me to fight him, not physically like that, but to engage in fights. Because I'm the kind of guy, I like to back away from a conflict. I like peace, and I like conversations and just talking about things. But we can't do that all the time. Sometimes a fight is absolutely required. Sometimes we've got to be ready to get in there and to fight one another. I learned that a little bit with my dad. I learned that mostly when I got married to Sarah. Once we started into that marriage relationship and once we got into those fights, I realized that I fought with her because I loved her. And if I didn't love her, I wouldn't have fought with her. And that was a sobering moment in time. If I hadn't loved Sarah, I wouldn't have engaged in those fights. We wouldn't have butted heads with one another. And we're going to understand what that means along the way here. So you can kind of follow along. We're not going to get into a passage just yet, but we're covering Acts chapters 13 and 14. So if you want to go ahead and open up your scripture, open up your Bible, like I said, you can kind of follow along and see what I'm going to be talking about, but I'm just going to hit and miss. Because like I said, along the way, it's a fight, it's a battle, and it's to the death. We see all these places that they go, and we see them come back, and it's good, and it's great, and it's wonderful because they're going to the ends of the earth. They're making disciples. The gospel is getting preached. Jesus is being talked about all over the place, and people are coming to him. How bad could it possibly be? Well, let's find out. In Salamis, well, not very much happens. There's no real fighting going on. But it's mostly because Paul and Barnabas and John Mark at the time stick to the synagogues. They go and they preach to the synagogues, and then they go home. And that's about it. They're not going out and going to the Gentiles like Jesus told them to in the first place. They're staying with what's comfortable. They're staying with what's easy. Sure, they're out of Jerusalem. They're out of Israel, but they're still in the synagogues. They're still in the Jewish subculture, and they're still talking to the Jews in the first place. Nothing wrong with that, just you're not going to get much out of that. From there, they go to Paphos. They go to the island, well, on the island of Paphos, I guess, and they encounter Elymas. They encounter this sorcerer who is actually preventing the gospel of Jesus from being preached. And it's a fight right there. They're fighting this other person who's trying to prevent Jesus from being preached and talked about. And Paul winds up striking him blind, and it works. He strikes him blind, and the governor who they were trying to reach in the first place believes in Jesus, and the gospel starts to get spread. So without that fight, the gospel wouldn't have continued. In Perga, you see another fight happen. It's a very small moment here in time, but John Mark goes away from the other two. He runs back home. He gets homesick or gets overwhelmed, or who knows what actually happened. But John Mark leaves the other two and goes back home. And we will see that seeds more fighting later on between Paul and Barnabas. And Paul takes such a rejection at that he says even that John Mark deserted them. at this point in time. So you've got more fighting going on. From there, they go to Antioch of Pisidia, and you see more fighting going on. And this is where the divide really starts to happen for Paul and for Barnabas from the Jews, because it's the Jews who reject the message, and they say, okay, we're going over here. We're going to the Gentiles. This is what we were called to in the first place. Let's do it. And from that moment on, this is where most of the fighting happens, is the Jews versus the Gentiles, the old ways versus the new ways, and who the message is for in the first place. So they go from there and they go to Iconium, and at Iconium, the Jews gather up this mob that scares them out of town. They were preaching and they were doing what they were supposed to, but they're still wind up with this fight going on, and they're forced out of town by a mob, by a rabble, by a rebellion that happens. In Lystra, they finally go directly to the Gentiles, and it works so well that they get worshipped as gods. Wait a minute, that's not what was supposed to happen. And there's a fight because that's not what you were supposed to be doing. You're supposed to believe in Jesus, not me. I didn't do this, he did it. And there's a fight that happens there. And the Jews jump back into the mix of things, and they rise up this rebellion even more and get everybody so riled up that they actually stone them, drag them out of town, and leave them for dead. More fighting. This isn't a happy trip. I wouldn't take this mission trip. This is dangerous. This is scary. This is battles all over the place and fighting all over the place. And finally, they reach the quote-unquote end. They reach the turnaround point. And at Derbe, they make many disciples. And suddenly you see that turning point happen, that all this fighting all along the way starts to bear fruit. You start to see this wonderful thing. It gives way, and many disciples are made in this. And then on the way back, you see more and more and more of that happen. They come back through all these places, and they strengthen them, and they encourage them, and they appoint elders and leaders, and they preach over and over. And the gospel of Jesus is preached everywhere. They continue with that message that Jesus changes everything. And it's good, and it's wonderful. And yet, once they get back from all that fighting, and once they feel like everything has finally given way and they've finally made headway, Acts chapter 15 happens. And Acts chapter 15 is one of the biggest fights of all. It's the culmination of the fight that happened all along the way, because all along the way so far, what's been happening is the Jews have been coming behind Paul and Barnabas, and they've been preaching that all these people who came to Jesus for Jesus, who were saved by Jesus, need to go back and follow all of the old customs and all of the old ways. And if they don't do that, then they're not truly saved. And there's a fight. And there's a fight now amongst the church. There's a council at Jerusalem. Paul and Barnabas go down to Jerusalem. And in chapter 15, verse 2, in my translation, it says that they disagreed with them, arguing vehemently. They fought and they argued and they worked this through. And they got against each other and they fought. So far what we've got is we've got people fighting against non-Christians. We've got people fighting against other Jews who are supposed to be part of the faith, who believe in Jesus kinds of Jews, actually transferred Jews. And then we've got fighting amongst the believers, amongst those who are the very core of the church at this time. So what do we do with that? How do we do this? Because fighting is going to happen along the way, whether we want it to or not. Fighting that happens along the way isn't always a bad thing. If they hadn't fought these fights, there would have been no give. If they had just given up and walked on and never come back, there wouldn't have been this return trip where they're able to strengthen and encourage. And all the people that began to come to Jesus in the first place wouldn't have continued down that path. They would have gone down this other path, and they would have gotten lost in the process. So fighting is absolutely necessary. It's something that we've just got to wrap our brains around, and we've got to understand it's going to happen whether we like it or not, because like I said, I'm more pacifist than I am anything else. I'm more of a peacekeeper. You know, we don't need to do this fighting thing. We don't need to raise our voices. And yet, I married an Italian. I have to deal with what all of that means. I have to learn. So let's learn. In the first council at Jerusalem, what do? They get together and they talk it out. They're fighting, they're yelling, they're arguing vehemently, but they're coming to a point where they all understand and they all look at what's happening. And it starts with them all coming together and them all seeking God together. They're looking at what God has done all around. Because right now what they're looking at is, how can we bring these people into Jesus and still remember that we're Jews? And how does this all come together at once? Because way back in Genesis 17, God told Abraham, if you're not circumcised, you're not a part of the covenant and you're not a part of the promise. So circumcision is a very vital, important thing. It is salvation in their minds in so many ways. It's a mark, it's a sign of the salvation in their minds in so many ways. But Jesus came and he changed everything. And then the Spirit came and it changed everything. And they're looking at that and they're seeing that and they're beginning to understand that even though they grew up with this being the way it always was and was supposed to be, maybe Jesus changes everything. Maybe something's supposed to be just a little bit different than we understood it before, different than what our normal traditions are. Maybe, since the Spirit came without them being circumcised, without them having experienced the baptism first, the Spirit actually invaded their lives as Gentiles. Peter and Cornelius, this comes up. Paul and Barnabas with the Gentiles, this comes up. These people are looking at all these different arguments. They're looking at all these different things, and they're stepping back on the outside and saying, who are we to fight against what God is doing? Let's seek God together. Let's throw those arguments out there. Let's get into this fight, and let's see what God is actually doing together in and through and amongst this. And they're willing to allow Jesus to change everything about who they have been all along the way. And at this moment in time, you see them come together and come up with this list of things that this is the lifestyle that you should be living. But all of a sudden, we're beginning to understand and we're beginning to see God move in such a way that circumcision is not a necessary thing. And if God is for it, who are we to be against it? If this is how God is moving, then why are we fighting over it? Let's come to a decision together. But there's another thing that happens at the end of Acts chapter 15. And this is where those seeds started to grow dissent amongst Paul and Barnabas. They're getting ready to go out on their second trip. They're going to go through another mission trip, and they're going to go through and they're going to strengthen, encourage, and appoint and preach all over again in all those towns that they've been in. And then Barnabas says, okay, let's grab John Mark and let's go. And Paul says, no, he deserted us. He should not be coming with us. And they argue and they fight. And in verse 38 it says, Paul disagreed strongly since he had deserted them. And in 39 it says the disagreement was so sharp that they separated. Barnabas took John Mark and went one way. Paul took Silas and went the other way. So sometimes we come together and we seek God together in a fight, and we duke it out and we deal with it and we come to a decision together. And sometimes we come and we seek God separately. Sometimes we're going to disagree with one another, and sometimes that disagreement is an okay thing to have. I don't have to agree with everything that Jordan agrees with. I don't have to agree with everything that Mike agrees with. We don't have to believe everything exactly the way that it's supposed to be. We don't have to believe. We don't have to decide that the way to approach things, that the way to go out in mission is exactly the same way to do it. And sometimes seeking God and dealing with this fight means that we separate. We divide to conquer. And yes, this is the last time we see Barnabas in Acts. But he goes on and he still does amazing things. And Paul, in other letters, brings Barnabas up. And while he has issues with him at times, he also still genuinely respects him as another apostle, as another person going out and preaching the message. Barnabas is not wrong while Paul is right. They disagree. And in this fight, they come to this separation. In this fight, they wind up going their own ways. And because of that, the gospel gets to go to Barnabas' direction, and it gets to go to Paul's direction. And we see the gospel spreading even more. Sometimes fights wind up with us separating from one another. But that doesn't mean that we can't still respect one another while we disagree with one another. Sometimes the fights wind up with us disagreeing for a while and coming together, and sometimes the fights wind up with us disagreeing and going apart. And that's just how it works. But no matter what was happening, the lessons that come out of Acts chapter 15 are that they're always seeking God. They're looking at how he's moving and working. They're looking at what he has done in the past, and they're following his spirit as best as they can. And they're going forward in God's plan and in God's will. And they're willing to allow Jesus to change everything about who they are. In between these mission journeys, we have one of the most amazing points of this fight played out. One of the most gruesome points of this fight played out. And it's probably the best understanding of how it is that we are to go forward and how we are to fight on this mission. And it's in Galatians chapter 5. Because in between these mission trips, Paul writes this letter back to all the churches that they had just gone through. And he writes it back to them because they're all dealing with this circumcision or not circumcision. Do we follow the old ways? Do we follow the new ways? What is it that we're supposed to do? Because we're being told all these different things. These are the people who are being caught in the middle of the fight that is happening. And Paul writes in Galatians chapter 5, starting at verse 11, and he says, "Dear brothers, if I were still preaching that you must be circumcised, as some say I do, why am I still being persecuted? If I were no longer preaching salvation through the cross of Christ, no one would be offended. I just wish that those troublemakers would want to mutilate you by circumcision would mutilate themselves." There's the fight. There's the fight. There's the dirty words, the ugly words coming out. I can't stand these people. He says, I wish they would just finish the job. I wish they would just chop it off entirely, is actually what he says. In verse 13, though, he picks it up and he changes the direction and he helps us come to the rest of the point of the argument. Yes, there's going to be fighting. Yes, it's going to happen all along the way. But what do we do? How do we fight? What are the rules? In Acts 15, it was that we seek God no matter what. Here in Galatians 13, in 5:13, for you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful selves. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command. We've heard this before. Love your neighbor as yourself. In and through and amongst and around and just pervading all of this must be love. I fight with Sarah because I love Sarah. And if I didn't fight with her, what kind of a love would that be? If I held those things back, if I disagreed with her about something that was very important, if we were trying to make a decision and this was a disagreement that we had, if she was doing something the wrong way or if I'm doing something the wrong way, we've got to have that fight. We've got to deal with this. And we've got to come to something together. Because we're doing it to seek God's will together, and we're doing it in love. Fights are inevitable. They're going to happen. But we can still love and respect one another all throughout the whole process. And Paul brings it home in that very next verse, the rest of the way. If you are always biting and devouring one another, watch out. Beware of destroying one another. It's okay to fight. Fighting's going to happen. Fighting can happen in love and respect. Fighting can happen in a way to seek God's will and in a way to be together, and sometimes in a way to understand that we are called apart from one another. But we cannot fight simply to fight. We cannot fight simply to annihilate one another. This is the word that Paul uses. We cannot fight simply to try to destroy one another. Our fight should never, ever be about beating the other person. And we've lost that along the way somewhere. We get so caught up when we're in the heat of the battle that we want to be right and we want them to be wrong. But we lose the whole point of it all. And we wind up biting and devouring and trying to annihilate one another. Sure, I fight with Sarah because I love her, but I do it because we're trying to find something together. We're trying to seek God's will. We're trying to move forward together. We're trying to love one another as best as we can and to be open and willing and able to have those conversations. But if I fought with Sarah just to fight with Sarah, what a terrible thing that is. What a waste of a fight that is. There's no love. There's no seeking together. There's no unity. There's no discipleship. There's no nothing in that. There's only devouring. We are called to fight in love with one another. It can happen. It's okay. Like I said, it's okay for me to disagree with you. It's okay for us to have some knockdown, drag-out fights every once in a while. It's scriptural. They do it. It happens. Jesus fought with the disciples who fought with him. Paul fights with everybody, it seems like. Peter fought with everybody, it seems like. There are fights that are going to happen. We must remember throughout it all that if we're not doing it to seek God, then we're not doing it for any good reason. If we're not doing it in love with one another, then we're not doing it for any good reason. And we're simply trying to devour one another. Love and do not devour. As we go on these missions, as we get out into the world, as we go to the ends of the earth, the rest of the world is going to see us fighting with one another. The rest of the world is going to see us fighting with them. What is it that we're fighting for? Are we fighting for these people? Are we fighting out of love for one another? Are we fighting to seek God together? Or are we fighting to devour one another, to devour those who don't believe and are doing everything the wrong way? Jesus said it's all summed up in one thing: love your neighbor as yourself. We have to remember that, and we have to be willing to understand that sometimes we don't truly know one another unless we've fought each other. Let's fight. Let's go out in mission, and let's be willing to butt heads. Let's be willing to fight for all the good and wonderful and right things in this world. And let's do it with love and respect for one another. Let's pray.